So in this video, I'm going to discuss why I personally think that Android is the subjectively better operating system when it comes to these portable retro handhelds. Now, I doubt that I'm the only one, but I'm sure many do. I respect Russ from Retro Game Core just, crazy amount. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one who wouldn't even have one of these if it were not for Russ. You know, clarifying, classifying, and labeling what handheld is good for what, and which handheld has what CPU, all that good stuff. That being said, I do disagree with some of his opinions and takes. Every now and then he'll say something that I just don't agree with. And recently, and it's been on my mind for a while, he said on his video of the RG353PS, the non-dual boot version, that you want to stick to Linux when it comes to these retro handhelds.
The previous model had a dual boot function into both Android and Linux, whereas this one is going to be Linux only. And I'll tell you a secret, on these devices, you really just want to stick with Linux anyway.
Now, this argument of Linux versus Android has never been more relevant with these RK3566 devices, of which I have 3 in front of me. Because they can do both Linux and Android. These mobile SoCs don't have Linux builds for them. Most of the Rock chip SoCs do, and that's why they picked the RK 3566 for this 3rd gen of handhelds. Now, I purchased this RG503 basically when it first came out. To my knowledge, it is the first 3566 handheld that was put on the market, which was very cool to me at the time, that we're moving away from the 3326 handhelds that I was not a big fan of that SoC. And I think towards the end not a lot of people were, because there was just so many of them. It's unfortunate that when this came out that they decided that it was not meant for Android, which at the time I thought was a big mistake, because it was a widescreen device, and generally these widescreen devices are best with Android because you can play modern games like Dead Cells, stuff like that, and on a widescreen device, it's just Android was made for widescreen devices. But this only has 1 gig of RAM and no touchscreen, so it was not destined for Android. We'll move on to a RK3566 device that can do Android, and the big difference between why this can do Android and the other can't is that this has 2 gigs of RAM and a touchscreen. You don't need a touchscreen to have an Android device, but I mean, it makes it a lot easier, and that touchscreen lets you do things like Nintendo DS emulation. Let's get into why these devices are best suited with Android. Right out the bat, it's just the little things like volume. When you turn the volume up, you get a nice little overlay that shows you what your current volume is, and when you turn it up and turn it down, that's the volume. And you will get this no matter what game you're playing. If you're in a game, we'll do Crazy Taxi, just for... So if I turn up my volume, well, hey, there you go. Now, let's say that I want to adjust the brightness. Obviously, there's not a button for that. In one of these Linux devices, you'd have a hotkey for it. But on an Android device, you can just go in here, slide this around, to whatever brightness you want. You've got an overlay that shows you of the brightness, how bright it is. It's not something that you can do with one of these Linux devices. Now, obviously, when you're not in a game, you will get a nice overlay telling you, what volume you're at. You won't get that in the game, which does stink. Now, even worse than that is the brightness. You can't adjust the brightness in the game, or whatever you're doing. You have to come to these system settings and adjust this brightness. And to do so, they updated it. Now, on the stock firmware, you had to keep pressing, each individual time you wanted to change it, but now you can just hold it, which is nice. That doesn't change the fact that, you can't do that in the game unless you use the hotkey, but when you use the hotkey, you don't know what the brightness is, if it's full brightness, half brightness, So another thing would be the sleep feature. Obviously this does have a sleep feature and it works, but The battery usage for one of these in sleep is just crazy. If we're not talking about, the gaming aspect of these, I think it's clear that, the Android is just better at, being a device. It's the small things like that. I'm sure there's a number of different better things about Android that I can't think of at the moment, but right out the bat, just small ease of life. You can multitask. And so we're playing our game. Oh man, I need to go look at a walkthrough for Crash Bandicoot. Well, you can, hop out of Duck Station. Let's see, look, I was looking at a walkthrough of Link to the Past, so kind of proves my point. And then hop back into Duck Station. I don't know. So, they being these mobile devices, they just do it better as Android because of the fact that, you can suspend these apps, and it's just all these tiny little, quality of life improvements that you have on the Android side of things that you don't get on the Linux side of things. Now, if you don't care about all those little small things and you can get past that, that's fine. But we'll get on to the meat and potatoes of the issue, and that's the standalone emulators. Now, I prefer to use RetroArch on anything that I can, up to a system that is kind of pushing the limits of the device. So for this device, that would be a Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and Dreamcast. You're not going to get the best experience for those systems in RetroArch rather than one of their standalone apps. Now, of the Linux-based firmwares, Gelos, I think it's always been my favorite. I've used ArcOS. I used ArcOS on the 3326 devices, but Gelos for these new generations has always been my favorite. I've always used it, and one of the biggest reasons that somebody else might prefer Gelos over ArcOS is the standalone emulators. And ArcOS, I believe they have the new standalone Duck Station for PlayStation. I'm not certain, but I know that they don't have Flycast for the Dreamcast. Playing Dreamcast really isn't an option on these devices if you don't have the standalone Dreamcast emulator. Here's a great example. You see how easy it was for me to flip the widescreen on? I think in RetroArch you have to go select the option, save the override, and then restart and all that stuff, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. The standalone emulators are such a big deal. It is so good. The one argument you might be able to make is that, universal controls, but even then, I think that on Duck Station and Dreamcast, or the Flycast, that you can do per game controls. The fact that, ArcOS doesn't have the standalone Flycast is a huge hit against ArcOS. Another standalone emulator, the standalone emulator on Linux for Nintendo DS is good. You play all your DS games good. It's got a fast forward, which is very important to me, with the system, is that being able to fast forward through a game, especially a game like Pokemon, for instance, right here. But the big deal about Nintendo DS on Android is that you have access to a touchscreen. The Drastic emulator on Linux is good. It's okay. It plays the games, but it just doesn't play. It doesn't give you the great experience of, playing Nintendo DS on a console. Honestly, I'd rather play Nintendo DS on a DS than the Linux-based consoles with no touchscreen. Now, all of these standalone emulators that you have on these Linux devices are usually just ports of the Android build ported to these Linux systems. Yeah, PPSSPP. This is just the Android build of PPSP ported to these Linux handhelds. Now, if all of the standalone emulators that you had access to on these devices were as good as PPSSPP was for these RK3566 devices, then I really couldn't make this argument. But unfortunately, in my opinion, only Flycast and PPSSPP are really as good as their Android counterparts. Now, like I said, there is a standalone version of Duck Station on here, but it's not nearly as good as the Android mobile version of Duck Station that you can get on the Google Play Store. Let's get into the biggest issue that I have about the standalone emulators, their performance, and ease of use on Linux. Is really the nail in the coffin to me for Android versus Linux argument with arcade 3566 based devices, and that's Nintendo 64. When it comes to Nintendo 64 on these arcade 3566 devices, they can play it. They can kill it. They play Nintendo 64 extremely well. As you can see up in the corner, that's 20 FPS. That's what Ocarina of Time was originally, made to do. And we'll turn it up to 3 times speed, so 60 FPS. And obviously it's not doing full, 60 FPS, but the fact that you have this much, headroom, over 2 times speeds in Nintendo 64. Now, Ocarina of Time isn't the craziest, hardest game to run, but it gives you a good idea of how well these system can handle Nintendo 64. And it can play it very well. There's Bruto. Arcade 3566 devices are awesome at it. There's very few games that I can't get to run on the Dreamcast the way I want them to run. When it comes to me playing these systems, I don't want just the bare minimums. If a system can run at the bare minimum, that's not really something that I want to play on it. If I want to play a Nintendo 64 game or a Dreamcast game, I want to play them, at the device's native resolution, in this case 480, which isn't, crazy hard to do, but I'll turn the anti-aliasing filter on and stuff like that. I don't want it to just fire up into the game and then you play the game as if you're playing on a console. No ability to fast forward or increase the resolution. I don't want that when it comes to playing these handhelds. When it comes to my needs and desires for playing these games, is that I want a better than console experience, and I don't think that's crazy unfair to ask of these devices. For instance, the RK3326 devices, you could play a lot of Nintendo 64 games on them. I never did because I didn't like the fact that you were at the breakneck of the system. The Nintendo 64 standalone emulator on the Linux devices sucks. Now, let's talk about the standalone emulator for Nintendo 64 on Linux. These devices can play Nintendo 64 in RetroArch. It just kind of stinks. It's just such a hassle that you don't deal with when it comes to all the other systems and RetroArch. I like RetroArch a lot. It's just not great for Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. And then you have the standalone emulators. That's what SA means. And the best one is going to be Rice. Well, we pick Rice. Oh, it has a lot more options now. This must be a... Hold on, maybe that's a part of the update. Okay, well, these updated options to the standalone N64 emulator, they don't take the whole bite out of my argument there, but this is very nice, being able to, even just have these few options like the internal resolution, the controller pack, and show FPS. Now, this is nice, but really, we're about to get into my big problem, and that is the input configuration. Standalone emulator, you have custom. Well, you'll notice that there's no way to map the buttons in custom. You just select it in 64 gamepad or default. Well, I managed to map them because I went into RetroArch and found out what the numeric value of each button is. Then I had to go into the file manager. I was incredibly shocked that I even managed to get it to work. I felt like a genius when I did get it to work because of how difficult it was, and I just didn't expect it to work. You can see my path. And so I had to go in here, and I couldn't get this file onto the SD card to export it to my PC and type this all up on my PC. So I had to type out this whole thing with the built-in keyboard in the the Linux operating system of all this nonsense. And so I had to go in and type all this up, and as you can see, for the C buttons, I wanted it to map to the control stick and to my buttons. But this is beyond a hassle because, one, I didn't even think it was going to work. I was just shooting for the moon. But the fact, I mean, obviously it's nice that it did work, but this is ridiculous. This is one of the big reasons that, like I said, N64 emulation and other standalone emulation on Linux just isn't as good as the Android equivalent. If you want a system just for playing N64, I would not recommend one of these Linux systems. I'd tell you to get this guy right here or the 353V. I am not a fan of the 353P at all. I don't like the 353P and I especially don't like the 353PS. I can talk about that later. But if you wanted a system to just play, Dreamcast and N64, and that was the peak of all you wanted for your, retro gaming, you don't need anything for a GameCube or anything like that. This device is awesome. It kills Nintendo 64. This device is good at it if you're willing to, jump through hoops and travel to the moon just to play N64 on it. That's not to say I like this device a lot. I think it's great, and I can talk about that more in the video when I discuss the RG353V. But N64 playback just isn't good on here. Dreamcast playback is only good because of the standalone emulator that's really good with this. And PlayStation on the standalone is acceptable. On these Linux devices, I just find that I use RetroArch and I don't mess with the standalone. Now, the argument of why you would want Linux over Android on these devices is this right here. Now, if you're somebody like me who's, really clever and loves tinkering with these and understands the devices really well, Android is, just a regular build of Android is with the, the stock launcher is perfectly fine. But some people want to pick up their device and they want to get that front end that you would see in here. I see I've just picked up the device, I've put it out of sleep. I can look at all of my systems. I want to play Super Nintendo. Now I've added all this scraped artwork and whatnot, so it doesn't come with this stuff. But even then you can just say, oh hey, I want to play Donkey Kong Country. And you're right into the game. I went through 2 menus to get to Donkey Kong Country, and here we are. So that's a good argument for Linux. My rebuttal to that would be Daijisho, which is really great. It really takes the thing out of, takes the argument away from Linux over Android because of how good Daijisho is. It basically why you would want Linux, and it's puts it on Android. So now you have the versatility of Android, web browsing, being able to go into the settings, on the fly, and you have the simplicity of Linux. So this is actually Gamma OS. It's a new firmware that's available for the T618 Ambernic devices. It's a game changer. It totally makes the Ambernic T618 devices, able to compete with these others devices such as the RP3 Plus. But it comes stock with Daijisho ready to go. So there you have your list of other apps. See, I can play my regular games. But it gives you the simplicity that you're looking for in Linux while you still have the versatility and capability of Android. So yeah, if your whole reason that you don't like the Android devices is because you like the simplicity of the Linux front end, well, that's no longer an argument that you can make because it exists right here. So yeah, if you don't like, if your whole hang up against the Android devices is you don't like, you like a simplified front end and not something like this, well, here you go. There's very few things that Linux can do on these devices that Android can't. Obviously, one of the things is the ports, which, yes, there are ports on the Linux devices that you don't have access to on Android, but even then, a lot of the good ports that are on those Linux devices, such as TMNT shredders, blah blah blah, it's right here. Another Metroid 2 remake. I first played it, I even first heard of it on the RG351V, but it doesn't matter because you can play it right here. Another argument for Linux is the fact that the newer model, the newer update, you can adjust the screen settings with contrast, illumination, and saturation. But on both of these Anbernic Android devices, this one's not rooted, but you can do it anyways. I don't know why. You have access to this app. It's called Saturate. Now, I had to use Magis just right there to get in and use this app. Here we go. Okay, so obviously I'm holding it portrait style, but the point being is that, it's not, that's another thing that you can do with Android that most think you can only do with Linux. So as you can see, it is actually adjusting the saturation. Now this device has a really good screen that's already pretty well saturated, but color depth be damned, I like a lot of saturation in my colors. Now you can adjust the contrast and illumination, but there's not really a reason to do that other than to mess with the saturation. So this device isn't rooted, and Anbernic actually sent me a faulty lemon or a faulty device, whatever you want to call it. I can't update to the newest update. I don't have access to the Google Play Store. So Anbernic kind of screwed me on this one. That being said, this device isn't rooted. I don't have Magisk installed, but I still have the ability to adjust saturation in this app. You can see the dot right there. It's going to the side. Yeah. So this screen's actually kind of low quality for how much you pay for the device. It's kind of ridiculous. The RK2023 is $60. I paid $60 for it, and it has a much better display than this $150 device, which is a bit ridiculous. But being able to crank up the saturation, well, that kind of, makes it a little bit better. I have Digisho installed on this device, so you can, and when you install it, it gives you the option to make this your home launcher. So Digisho really makes these Android devices, it gives you all the best parts of Linux with all the best parts of Android. I don't understand, why some people think that, oh, I don't want my handheld device to be Android. I prefer it to be Linux. Well, there's not a lot of good arguments for Linux, against Android. Other than the ports is really the only thing I can think of that the Linux does better.